Hello and welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. It's been about a year now, give or take, since I set up this palette, and I've had to refill some of the colours a few times, which I'll go over in a moment. But I need to clean and prepare this palette for a trip that I have coming up. I'm going to be staying with family for 3 months, and I've been selecting up all the art supplies I'm going to be taking with me for that again. And I wanted to make sure that this palette had plenty of paint in it for my plans for those 3 months. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk you through the paints that I'm using, go through the pigments, and whether or not I am enjoying them in this palette, and if I want to continue using them or if I want to switch them out. So I'm going to be cleaning them first off using a water brush because some of the paints are a little bit dirty, and then from left to right, I'm going to go through each pigment. So we're starting off with PY 150, which is Nickel Azo Yellow, and I use Yellow Lake by Senelia at the moment. Not for any particular reason other than it's just the first one that I tried and I've just stuck with it since. It's an indispensable mixing yellow for me, and I use it for a lot of different green and orange mixes. I find that I end up putting it in any palette that I make pretty much over the last few years. And in some cases, I even use it just as my only yellow. So in my micro palette, it is my only yellow. But I have felt recently like I might want to branch out a little bit and try out some new yellow pigments, perhaps just through some sample dots. I have been on a no-buy when it comes to new pigments for a little while and just picking up replacements when I run out of the pigments I'm already using. But I have been feeling an itch to maybe branch out a little bit more with my yellows and potentially my warmer reds as well, which I could do through sample dots. I'm going to be refilling this colour for now just because I know that it is a yellow that I use constantly and I do still have plenty of paint left in this tube. But it's something that's on my radar moving forward, is trying out some new yellows. It's also worth noting, especially for people who might not be as familiar with some watercolor pigments or might just be starting out, that this pigment does contain a heavy metal. In this case, it's nickel, but you will also come across pigments that contain things like cobalt and also cadmium. Cadmium is usually the one that a lot of people hear about first. But I recommend that you go online and you look at some health and safety recommendations for painting with these pigments if you choose to use them. It's going to mainly be things like minimizing skin contact, washing your hands frequently, not eating while you're painting and things like that. But I recommend that you go and check, especially if you're just starting out and you might not be as familiar with these things. Next up, we have Azo Orange, which is the pigment PO62. This is a yellow-leaning orange, and for the purpose of this palette, it fills the role of a warm yellow in a split primary. So if you look from left to right, you'll see that I have 2 yellows, 2 reds, and then 2 blues, and that's my split primaries in this palette, with this having the role of the warm yellow. For those who aren't as familiar with split primaries, just to very briefly go over it, you have a cool yellow, a warm yellow, cool red, warm red, cool blue, and a warm blue. And this is my warm yellow. I am relatively new to this pigment in comparison to some of the other pigments in this palette. I decided to put it in last year in order to learn more about it and get used to it. For a long time, I was very stuck in the yellows that I was using, and to an extent I still am, which is why I might branch out my yellows a little bit more. But I did find over the last year, it took me a while to reach for this paint. It's only been really in the last 6 months, especially the last 4 months, that I've been using this colour more frequently in my painting. And I even did a painting recently where I tried to focus on this as a mother colour and try to use it in most of the mixing. So for now, this is going to be staying on my palette because I am starting to actually become comfortable learning to use it, and I want to keep that momentum going and learning more about it and where it fits in my painting practice. Now we have transparent pyrrole orange, and this is P071, and it's the old version of this paint. So this is the discontinued version of it. You can still get this colour, but it's slightly different in its hue and I think also the opacity, but I'm not sure as I haven't tried the new version myself yet. This is the warm red in my split primary, and I do enjoy it, but I'm deciding on whether or not to still put it in the palette at this point, so we're going to skip on to the next colour for now, which is Rose Madder Lake, more well known as Quinacridone Rose, which is PV19. It's a transparent, cool leaning rose red, and this is my cool red in my split primary. This is a pigment that I've been using for a really long time. I've tried a couple brands. My first professional line of PV19 was the really tiny tubes of the Daniel Smith split primaries, so that was how I tried Quinacridone Rose in artist grade pigments for the first time. And then I ended up trying the Sennelier version, and I've just stuck with that for now. I really like that I can get a big tube. I think it's 21 milliliters in Sennelier. And as you can see, I've been whittling away at this large tube over time. Quinacridone Rose and the colour next to it, which is Ultramarine Next, are two of my most used pigments. So I'm constantly refilling and I need a lot of paint for that reason. So it's nice being able to get larger tubes like this. Now, I'm interested in trying some other brands for PV19, but at the moment I still have plenty of the tube, well, I say plenty, but a few more refills left in that one tube there, but I am going to need to replace it relatively soon. So I could use this opportunity to try out some new brands, but first having a look at some sample dots. I'm probably not going to go back to Daniel Smith for now. I'd either get Sennelier again or try out a new brand, I think. I do really, really love the Daniel Smith PV19, but I do like the hue and the properties of the Sennelier version as well, just as much for different reasons. I really, really love the tone of the hue of the Daniel Smith version, but I would probably prefer to get a larger tube like this. So this is the 21 ml tube when it's full or nearly full in the case of this one here, and this is Ultramarine, which is PB29. And this is by far my most used pigment. I am constantly having to refill this in my palettes. You can see that I've got a little dent, a brush-shaped dent in the middle of the in the well. So I am just cleaning this off real quickly. It's relatively clean in comparison to especially my yellows, but I use this for lots of different mixing. And I prefer to use the Sennelier version because Sennelier has quite a low granulating ultramarine, and I like that because I like to use it for more applications. I love granulating colours, but those tend to be a special effect pigment for me, and we do have a couple heavily granulating colours coming up later in this palette, but for most of the time when I'm using ultramarine, it's nice to be able to use it in a wider range of applications, especially when I might not necessarily want really heavy granulation. When I do want really heavy granulation, I use Schminke Ultramarine. I think it's Schminke French Ultramarine, but I'll put on screen what it is if I got that wrong. That is one that I bring out when I specifically want heavy granulation. This is a paint that's going to be sticking around for a while. I do still have plenty in that tube. I use it constantly, and it's just a classic for me at this point. Next up we have another painting classic, which is Phthalo Blue Green shade, otherwise known as PB15:3. This is my cool blue, and it's the remains of the Daniel Smith Essentials split primary set that I got years ago. I ended up using up the rest of the tube to refill this well, so I am out of that now. Whether or not I'm going to restock with the same brand or try a new one is up in the air at the moment. This isn't my most used blue. As you can see on the palette, I do have quite a few blues, and phthalos especially are very, very intense, so I find that a little paint goes a really long way, which is one reason why this tube has lasted me so long, even though it is a tiny, tiny tube. It's also because for a long time I was really, really in love with phthalo turquoise, and I was using that as a cooler blue in combination with my other blues for quite a while. But I've been falling back in love with phthalo blue green shade again this last year, especially with having it on my palette, and I love it mixed with my red brown paint, which will be coming up in the earth tones. It creates gorgeous deep dark neutrals, different browns and different greys when combined with that brown. Next up, we have one of my favourite blues, which is Indanthrone blue, sometimes also called Indanthrene blue, Anthraquinone blue. It has a few different names, but it is the pigment number PB60. I'm currently using the one by Daniel Smith, and it's staying on my palette at the moment. Once I've used up this tube, I am wanting to try out another brand, potentially the M. Graham one, or possibly Da Vinci. We'll see. I've also had the Core one recommended to me, but I don't have that much experience with Core and its unique binder properties and the fact that it, it disperses very readily. But I'm interested to potentially try a new pigment once I've finished this tube. I love this colour for many different reasons, but it is a muted blue, and I love it for green mixes, for mixing with browns to create neutrals, and I've got a kitten with me, so if you can hear purring, that is why. I've lost my train of thought now. I love this colour. It's a firm favourite. I've been using it for a little bit now, at least a year, I think 2 years possibly. And it's definitely staying on my palette, at least until I potentially try out another brand once I've used up this tube. The final blue is Cerulean Blue Chromium. This is another paint that has heavy metals in it, so just check for that if it's something that concerns you. And this is PB36. I use this as a special effect colour most of the time. It's when I want really heavy granulating, lighter hue blues than I would with ultramarine. This is my most granulating blue on this palette because I use a less granulating ultramarine, and I love it mixed with green mixes and also in some purple mixes and in dark mixes where I want to add some light granulation to it. So I'll pop up a few examples on screen that I can think of. I know that I did the whale peach sober illustration last year using this, so that'll probably be the one that I put on screen. This is a colour that I'm keeping on my palette because I know that it's a firm favourite for me when it comes to doing special effects and heavy granulation. Okay, this is when I made up my mind and I decided to continue using the transparent Pyrrole Orange. I know that I really love this colour, and I do know that the current version of it that I have, or the old version of it I have, is discontinued. So I feel like I should just use up what I have, and then I can potentially explore new warm red options for me. I do love this colour, and I've enjoyed it in this palette spot, so I feel like for now that's the decision I'm going to make. Whether I refill it next time or I wait until my tube is all filled up, I'll leave for future me to worry about, but for now that's what I've decided to do. And hello, Coconut. Have you come for more cuddles? I don't know if you can hear him, but he's saying hello. Okay, I took a moment to just let him settle down, and he's currently asleep in my lap, so hopefully he'll be quiet enough for us. But now we have two greens that might cause some confusion in people. The first is Viridian, which is actually PG7, also known as phthalo green blue shade. And then we have Viridian, which is the true Viridian, and that is PG18. And PG18 is granulating. It's also usually much harder to re-wet. It also has a heavy metal in it. And then PG7 is a lot more intense and saturated. It's non-granulating and staining. Both of these have uses in a palette for me. They share a very, very similar hue. The main difference between the two of them for me is the granulation. Sometimes I want to have granulation, sometimes I don't. And you'll see that's a common theme throughout this palette, especially in my blues, my browns, and my greens, is that I like to have the option for granulation and for non-granulation as well. And that's why I have both of these on my palette. Do you need both of them? It depends on what your preferences are. And for PG7, this is my main mixing green. I use this to mix all kinds of greens. That being said, there's a green coming up that's starting to be a very common mixing green for me as well, but PG7 is a classic green that most people will come across at some point, and I use it for mixing dark tones by mixing it with the brown red. I also mix it with blues and yellows to create varying greens. I also like to mix it with my earth tones like burnt sienna and sometimes yellow ochre to create earthy greens. So I get lots of variety in terms of mixing. Because it's a very intense saturated hue, I don't often get to use it in its full intensity. With Viridian, I do sometimes use it just on its own, but I mainly like to use it in mixes where its granulation will really, really shine. And one of those mixes is creating essentially like a moon glow. And I sometimes combine this with the cerulean blue as well to create a very highly granulating and separating out effect. I also like using it in green mixes where I want to have a little bit of granulation in there just to add some texture and variety to those greens as well. The last green that's in this palette is Azo Green, and that's PY129. So you might notice that even though it is called green, it's actually classified as a yellow pigment, and it is a green leaning cool yellow. And I originally put it on this palette in part to learn more about it and get used to using it. And I will say that over the last year, I have definitely been doing that way more so than the Azo Orange, which I've only just recently started getting into using and getting to know. I've been figuring out more and more mixes with this pigment. I especially love it for mixing greens, of course, but I have also started to experiment with using it to mix different skin tones and in some cases some different browns and things as well. I really got into using this as a mother color in a recent illustration, and I kind of used the last year of my experience painting with this color and then applied it to this illustration. And I was able to mix all kinds of different tones, from the skin tones to the dress to some of the browns in the tree trunk and then, or the tree branch, sorry. And also the skin tones as well were also mixed with this included. And it was a real test of my mixing knowledge that I've built up over the last year or so. And now we're into the earth tones, starting off with yellow ochre. I like to set up my palettes so that my earth tones lead off from my greens, and I usually start with yellow ochre or my yellow earth tones and then lead on into the warmer and then gradually darker and darker hued earth tones. And this yellow ochre is one of my favorites. I also really like the one that I tried from Isaro, but for different reasons, because that one's a lot more opaque. Generally speaking, I like to use transparent and semi-transparent pigments for most applications, but I do occasionally like to dip into some opaque pigments and opaque versions of hues for special effects, especially when I'm working on cold press paper and I'm not doing as much line art. So it is nice having some variety there by having the Isaro one around that I got to try years back. But for most general purposes, this one fits my needs really well because it's a little bit more on the semi-transparent end, and I'm able to use it for line and wash as well as no line work variations in illustrations and paintings. And for now, I'm happy to continue using this. Along similar lines, I'm going to be keeping with the same burnt sienna. I love this colour for similar reasons as the yellow ochre. It has a nice level of transparency for me. It's definitely not fully transparent, but it is a little bit more on the semi-transparent end, especially in comparison to other burnt siennas I've tried. But I particularly love the hue of this burnt sienna, and it's one of my most used pigments, as you can probably tell by the dents that form in it very, very quickly, even after refilling it. And I'd probably say that it falls just behind my ultramarine, maybe to the same degree as my quinacridone rose, possibly, maybe, but I usually flip-flop, I've noticed over the years, on my use of burnt sienna versus burnt umber. I tend to go through periods where I use burnt sienna for most of my earth tone needs, and then other times it's burnt umber. And that's especially true when I'm mixing grays and neutrals using blues, especially ultramarine. I flip-flop between which ones I usually reach for at the moment, and for this past year it has mainly been the burnt sienna, but I have noticed that I am reaching a little bit more for burnt umber in mixes at the moment. But things shift over time, and it's nice to have a few different earth tone options. As you can see, I do have 5, and this for me is quite a condensed amount of earth tones. The third earth tone we're going to be looking at is brown red. You'll sometimes hear me say red brown in videos because I get confused which way round it is, but it is brown red for some reason. This is PBR 25, and I am nearly out of the tube that I have for this, and I'm going to be continuing to use it because it's one of my most used and most well-loved mixing colours. I use it for mixing all sorts of colours and for dulling down greens and blues. I love it mixed with Indian Throne and also with Phthalo Blue. Not as much ultramarine. I will admit I don't tend to reach for that combination as much as I do the other two, but this is a gorgeous mixing color for me. I also love it for skin tones, for mixing browns, for adding to green. You can get really nice green by mixing this with PG7. So I get all sorts of variety in mixing with this. It's also a very transparent color. So this is my most transparent earth tone on this palette. And that just means that I have a little bit of variety available to me when I want really, really transparent colors. I can reach for this more so than I would burnt umber or burnt sienna. And speaking of burnt umber, I'm going to be leaving this slot as it is because I've actually run out of the colour now, and I'm going to be trying out a new brand to me and seeing how I like that for the first time, which is going to be fun. So we're moving on to the next earth tone, which is Bloodstone Genuine. This is a speciality colour for me. It's something that I use for special effects. It's the most granulating earth tone in this set, and it's kind of a little bit like my Viridian and my Cerulean Blue. It's very heavily granulating, and I use it for textures and for very heavily granulating effects in mixes. I usually like to use it in mixes for that reason and not really on its own. It does look very, very pretty on its own, and I would say that the only times I ever maybe possibly reach for it on its own would be for painting rocks. I really love using this for painting rocks and getting slight variation just through the granulation with it. It almost has like a very muted purple tone to the brown, which I absolutely adore. I really, really love it. And for now, I'm keeping it on this palette just because I feel like it's not really taking up a spot that I would use another colour for, if that makes sense. I do reach for it. I don't reach for it as much as my other earth tones, but it still has a place in this palette for me for now. And with that, this is where my palette is at a year after I set it up, roughly. And for the most part, things have changed the same, but things have stayed the same, not changed. But I do have an idea now of what I'm going to be changing out, starting with the burnt umber. That's going to be changing to the new brand that I'm going to be trying now that I've run out of that pigment. And then I'm probably going to switch out the transparent pyrrole orange once that's running out as well. I might try some other earth tones here and there. I am going to have to replace my brown red soon, but I'm more likely leaning towards just restocking the exact same one again. But we'll see when we come around to that, what I end up deciding on. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was interesting to you. I love learning about how people change their color and pigment choices over time and what stays the same as well. And hopefully I'm going to get lots of painting in this summer with this palette since I'm taking it with me. But for now I'm going to let it dry and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day. Bye!